this week for week 10 as far as Mesley and the reflection prompt. The distinction Mesley draws between unilateral and relational power is one of those ideas that sounds obvious once you hear it, but cuts against almost everything most people actually do. Unilateral power is the model everybody grows up absorbing without being taught it directly. The person at the top gives orders, doesn't answer to anyone below them, and measures their strength by how little they have to change in response to the people around them. Mesley traces this all the way back through the Western tradition. From Aristotle's unmoved mover that affected everything while being affected by nothing, to Descartes' substances that exist independently of everything else, to the everyday cultural assumption that the boss who can fire anyone but can't be fired by anyone is the one who really has power. And it makes me think of one person in particular. The tradition is consistent and it runs deep. What's worth sitting with before agreeing or disagreeing with Mesley is why that model is so appealing in the first place. It isn't just vanity. The people most vulnerable from unilateral power, the abused child, the battered person, the one at the bottom of any hierarchy, have real reasons to want the ability to resist being affected by others, and I know that my own way. Chapter 7 is honest about this. The desire is not to be pushed around, humiliated, or controlled as a reasonable response to a world where those things happen constantly. The problem isn't that people want protection. The problem is that the tradition took that reasonable desire and elevated it into a metaphysical ideal, made it the definition of what's valuable and real, and then used that definition to justify the same structures of domination that made protection necessary in the first place. That's where the framework breaks down and where criticism has to be specific rather than general. Unilateral power doesn't just fail ethically. It fails on its own terms. Loomer's point in Chapter 8 is that if you were to genuinely be unaffected by the world around you, you would cease to exist, because you are constantly creating yourself out of relationships with that world. The person who shuts everyone out to protect their identity ends up with a smaller world, not a larger one. The person who can be influenced by another without losing themselves inhabits more of a reality than the one who walls it off. That's not a consolation prize for people who couldn't manage dominance. It's a description of what actually makes a life rich rather than defending it. The harder question the prompt is asking is whether most people actually operate from relational power, even when they think they want unilateral power. And the honest answer is probably yes in ways they don't recognize. Most people don't actually want to be untouchable. They want specific relationships where they're genuinely known and affected and still okay. What they're trying to avoid isn't influence itself. It's the kind of influence that erases them. That's a real distinction, and Mesley doesn't always make it clearly enough. The fear of being changed isn't irrational. It's a reasonable response to having been changed badly before, to having been in relationships where openness was used against you, rather than held carefully. That's where the relational power framework needs more friction than Mesley gives it. He's right that the capacities to be affected is what distinguishes richer and more complex forms of life from simpler ones. That the progression from electrons to human consciousness is a progression and the ability to take in the world rather than resist it. But that claim lands differently for people who have experienced sustained abuse or violence, where openness was precisely the condition that made the harm possible. The framework doesn't fully account for the fact that relational power requires a certain kind of safety to operate in, and that safety isn't distributed equally. Telling someone in a dangerous situation to practice openness and vulnerability is not relational power, it's just exposure. And this is also where I believe that a lot of philosophers had an easy life, so it's easy for them to look at the world this way. Where people that have, like me, that have been in violence and unstable conditions, your mind isn't open. It's black or white. It's, I'm survival. And I think it's silly sometimes to read these people's views. And my instant thought is, oh, they had it easy. They don't even know the other side of the world. What Mesley gets right, and what's worth defending, even those claims criticism on the table, is that unilateral power as a model for what's most valuable has produced worse things human beings do to each other. The peak examples of unilateral power, as Chapter 7 puts it, are torture chambers, slavery, rape, and child abuse. That's not a coincidence. A framework that equates value with the ability to affect others, while some people as less than fully real. And I also think religion does that. And it does, actually. I don't even think it actually does. The relational alternative isn't naive about this. Gandhi, King, and other Mesley points to weren't passive. They were operating from a position that required more strength than dominance, not less. Because staying open and responsive under sustained pressure is genuinely harder than shutting down and issuing orders. The model that better describes what's valuable in human life is relational power. But the honest version of that argument has to acknowledge that the fear of being changed isn't always the problem. Sometimes it's the record of what happened last time someone was open, and that record deserves more weight than the framework currently gives it. And that's basically my whole frame of reference in life.